Law enforcement of Reddit. What was the most scariest paranormal call you have responded to? Story 1. I worked at the Naval Hospital in Camp Pendleton in 2013. I was part of the transition team that moved the last of the belongings that they wanted from their old location to their new one. Along with others on my team, we were part of the final sweep as far as cleaning up, waxing the floors, and locking up some of the higher-level rooms within the old hospital. It was a nice gig because there was a ton of office supplies that were going to be thrown away, along with some office chairs. I like to draw, so I took home 2 chairs, one for me and one for my roommate, along with a plethora of pens and paper. In my duty section, there was also the security role, watching over the barracks just outside the hospital. With the Navy being the Navy, they didn't transfer anyone over to the new barracks until about a full 8 months after the move to the new hospital. So someone still had to stand duty there, as well as patrol the old hospital to keep away any would-be vandals from a place they thought was completely abandoned. Of course, I ended up getting duty one day and started getting people coming into the commons area telling me to go look at the hospital. There was very clearly a light on the 6th or 7th floor, with a figure standing motionless watching outside. I put up a sign saying that I would be leaving the office and to call my personal number should they need anything. Usually, it was just to reset their key cards, but each room had 4 rooms within it, so people often just called their roommates to open the doors instead of waiting for me to reset their key card. It was already pretty late at night, so I wasn't worried about it. I went to the hospital, and it was still completely locked all around. I checked to make sure that no windows were ajar. The hospital didn't have any that opened. I even tried to lift the back hatch, where linens and new supplies came through by truck, and that was still secured. I had no other way of getting in myself, so when my chief came down around 2 a.m., as they seldom did, but were required to at least once a night, I made a report of it. By this time, the figure was gone, but the light remained on. I was never told if they ever found anyone, or if it was even followed up on, for that matter. But it was one of the creepiest things I remember from being there. Story 2. I am a police officer working on an emergency response team in a busy London borough. We received a call about a suspected domestic incident in a block of flats. The informant said she could hear screaming and sounds of disturbance coming from the flat above her own. Once we arrived, my colleague and I knocked on the door of the flat. The informant said the noise was coming from. I had heard nothing on my way up and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from the address. To be honest, I heard nothing at all. After knocking twice, we had no response. My colleague left me to go downstairs and speak directly to the informant. I stayed by the door. I knocked again, and after some time, it was answered by an elderly woman. She had clearly been asleep and was alarmed to see me standing outside. I told her that someone had called, saying they could hear a disturbance coming from her address. I asked her if there was anyone else inside with her. She looked bemused and told me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. I asked her if I could come in to satisfy myself that no one else was there. She invited me in, and I walked into what was a small 2-bedroom flat. The flat was in darkness, apart from her hall light and her bedside lamp. I began searching through the flat. As I approached the final door, the living room, my colleague called me on the radio. He told me that he was on his way and asked if I was okay. I told him everything was fine, wondering why he sounded so flustered. He told me that he was with the informant and could also hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was in. I told him that he must be mistaken, as I was almost done searching the flat and that I had heard nothing whatsoever. I have to admit, I felt a sense of unease as I opened the final door. Like all the other rooms, it was in darkness but was freezing cold. My breath misted immediately. There was no one in the room and no signs of disturbance. No window was open. I called my colleague and asked him to listen for my footfalls. He said he could hear my feet as I stamped them, but said that the screaming had stopped. This coincided with me opening the door. I left shortly after, apologizing to the elderly woman for waking her. I have no rational explanation for this at all. My colleague and I left feeling very creeped out. Story 3. Late evening, maybe a decade ago, I ended up running silent to a call with additional units in tow. The caller reported hearing footsteps on her 2nd floor when she was in the kitchen. She lived alone, middle-aged, divorced, no kids, and had no expected company. She was outside across the street when we arrived. obviously unnerved and being calmed by her neighbor. Other units showed up almost as I did and set up a perimeter at the corners of the property. We talked with her, got permission to enter, so we decided we'd announce ourselves and clear the house. 3 of us stacked up on the front door, announced, and made entry, while the other officers viewed the windows from a distance under concealment. She was in the midst of making a really late dinner, so the house smelled really good. I remember how good it smelled. Anyway, we cleared the ground level and made our way to the stairs when we heard it. Obviously footsteps on the wood floors above us. Not panicky, oh shit I'm caught footsteps and running to hide or escape. No, these were calm, methodical, and almost paced. We announced ourselves again and received no response, except the pacing started to fade away. Quietly, I made my way up the steps, adrenaline pumping, and concentrated on pieing the corner at the top. I stopped a few stairs shy of the corner, breathed, and proceeded up. The hallway at the top was pitch black. And after successfully clearing the top corner, we made our way down the hallway, clearing rooms. Nothing. Nobody. Not even a critter. Not that any critter would ever make what I describe as human footsteps on hardwood. After the initial search, a few of the other officers involved also checked every nook and cranny. Bed, closet, rack, hell, even the washer, dryer, appliances, and cupboards were thoroughly searched. Nothing was out of order. Nobody was hiding anywhere. Eventually, we invited the lady back into her residence and reassured her that there was nobody in there, attributing the noise to maybe wood shrinkage or expansion in the home. None of the officers outside or after our initial search had seen anybody leave the top or bottom floors or windows. The house had no indications that anybody had tried to force open a window or door. I stayed behind for about 30 minutes once the other officers cleared the call and waited while her friend showed up to stay the night with her. I went over basic security measures with her and double-checked that all her windows and doors were not compromised. She fed me well-done lasagna as I waited, and to this day, I'm convinced that I interacted with another dimension of life that day. Story 4. About 4 years ago, a woman named Lucy called our non-emergency line to report that she had locked herself out of her house. I responded to take the report in case the fire department needed to force entry. Upon arrival, I immediately noticed a burning candle and some religious statues in the upstairs window. The light in this room was also on. I found this a bit odd and couldn't explain why. I approached Lucy, who appeared to be around 65 years old, and asked what had happened. She explained that she had gone to her car to get groceries for herself and her mother, but had forgotten her keys inside. She assured me that her mother was home. Lucy then revealed that her mother had actually died 6 years ago, but she continued to live with her in the bedroom with the lit candle. Lucy claimed that her mother's presence was known through various occurrences like lights turning on and off, doors opening and closing, and the bathroom faucet turning on. After inspecting the perimeter of the home, I found an unlocked window into the kitchen. With Lucy's consent, I climbed in through the window. As I stepped onto the kitchen floor, I heard an audible click. At the same time, the lights in the stairway and upstairs hallway turned off. I quickly walked to the rear sliding door to my right and informed Lucy of what had happened. Lucy laughed and said that was just her mother saying hello. While I believed Lucy's story, I still had to do my due diligence to ensure no one else was inside. I radioed for backup, and within minutes, my partner arrived. The first thing he asked about was the lit candle in the window. While clearing the upstairs, we discovered the room with the candle and noticed that it was now extinguished. There were no open windows, fans, vents, or other obvious sources that could have extinguished the flame. We exchanged uneasy glances and returned downstairs to leave. To our surprise, the upstairs lights turned off behind us. We continued to talk to Lucy for a few more minutes and suggested she get a battery-operated candle for safety. However, Lucy clearly didn't take our advice. To this day, the candle still burns in the open window most nights when I drive by. Every now and then, I stop and talk to Lucy to see how she and her mother are doing. Story 5. Early in my career, the elevators in the older section of CIA headquarters, known as the Original Headquarters Building, or OHB, were known to have quirks. I think they still do. Occasionally, the elevator would stop, and the doors would open on a floor with no one there, and no one on the elevator had requested that floor. I heard secondhand that the thing to do when that happened was to say, "Good day, Mr. Director." because it was assumed that the doors opened for the ghost of Alan Dulles. OHB was his project, as many know, but he was never able to move into his office, having been replaced as CIA director just before it was ready. Story 6. I was a military policeman in the Marine Corps. While stationed at Camp Lejeune, a dispatcher got a call from a terrified wife saying that kids were trying to get into her house. It was a little after midnight. We thought this was just a drunken spouse call, and responded, not on high alert, just kind of wanting to make sure the lady was all right. We knocked on the door and announced ourselves. The woman was obviously shaken, still with puffy eyes. She told us that 4 children with red eyes rang her doorbell and asked to come inside, and when she refused, they got angry. The kids terrorized her for 5 minutes. Her own child had been put to bed, and her husband was deployed. I decided to do a once-over of the whole housing property, and there was a whole lot of nothing going on. My partner and I decided to do a little walking patrol of that housing area. In each housing area, there's usually a decent-sized playground. As we were walking up to it, we both saw some kids swinging. Curfew is 8 p.m. for young children unless accompanied by an adult on base. I was really spooked at this point, and I knew my partner was too. Kids looked over at us and just stared. We started backtracking, then turned and didn't look back. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night either. Later on, I looked up the incident online, since Lejeune is famous for paranormal activity, and it turns out the little red-eyed kids have been reported before. Story 7. Not really scary, but possibly paranormal, and a case I was never able to solve. 3 years ago, I was called in to investigate a burglary at a cemetery. When the forensics guys and I finally went out there, it was a slow morning. None of the responding deputies had actually gone inside yet. 4 deputies and a sergeant were busy securing the scene from the outside because it was still dark out, and they didn't want to go into the dark mausoleum that had been broken into. Apparently, they felt much safer with us overweight, non-sworn employees around, so we went inside together. The exterior door to the mausoleum had been forced open, and we started looking around for signs of anything stolen or vandalized. Eventually, we found that one of the grave sites in the mausoleum, almost 15 feet off the ground, had its cement plaque shattered, and the coffin was pulled out and left sprawling on the floor. All contents of the coffin were missing, including the cremated remains of 3 people, the last of whom had died in 2004. A person would have had to bring their own ladder to pull this out, or they would have to be at least 13 feet tall. According to the forensics guy, it looked like the plaque for the coffin had been shattered from the inside due to water damage. Still, it seems oddly coincidental that the plaque would break on the same night of a break-in at the mausoleum. It hadn't been accessed since 2004, so almost 12 years prior. The people in the gravesite had a single living relative. I called them, exchanged pleasantries, and then when I asked about the mausoleum, they said, "No habla English," and hung up. It's probably drug-related somehow. But this is exactly the kind of thing that happens at the start of a vampire or zombie apocalypse movie. Story 8. So, I'm not in law enforcement, but I worked security for a few years out of high school and have some weird stories. One time, my friend, another guard, and I became pretty close, and we would often talk to each other over the phone and earpiece for most of the night while patrolling. One night, he found a door to the basement of the oldest building in our state, or city, something like that, and the basement was also infamously haunted. He hadn't said anything about what he was doing other than which building he was at. We had been silent for a few minutes when I suddenly heard the word door being whispered, hissed in a drawn-out way, with an audible inhale-exhale at the end. At first, I thought it was him, so I asked him to repeat himself. He was confused and said he hadn't said anything. I didn't want to freak him out, so I didn't say anything until after he'd left the building about what I had heard. He was pretty freaked out by it, and it would have been very out of character for him to do that just to mess with me. Another incident, which was probably just a weird coincidence, happened when we were transporting a psych patient from an ER to a psych facility. The patient was completely out of his mind, mostly unaware of everything around him, verbal but not making any sense, and in an almost sleepwalking state from appearances. The nurses had doped him up but said he'd been in the same mental state beforehand, just more agitated. The antipsychotics had only really calmed him down. The first thing he did after we loaded him in the vehicle and I sat down next to him was turn to me, appearing suddenly lucid, and say conversationally, "Well, you look like you're ready to bury another dog." The morning of that day, I had found my dog passed away in her sleep, and had buried her. After looking at me expectantly for a few moments, while I was confused and shocked, the appearance of lucidity on his face slowly faded away, and he turned back to mumbling, rocking back and forth, and trying to eat the bag of chips the nurses had sent with him. Not the chips inside, mind you, but the bag itself. My least favorite building to patrol at night often had doors unlocked on my second and third patrols, after I had found them locked earlier. Many times, bay doors, which required a latch to be lifted from the inside, would be unlocked. The building had alarms attached to every door that I had to disarm each time I opened one, so I know they worked. The building owners weren't concerned in the least and simply said that the doors did that, and that's why they hired us to keep them locked. If it had been employees opening one of the entrance doors, I would have been able to see which employee and at what time they had unlocked it, which happened occasionally, but I was always informed beforehand. I also heard hissing noises, thumping from the roof, and the occasional bay door being shaken, as though by wind, but with none of the adjacent bay doors moving. That place creeped me out. The guard before me had quit at 2 a.m, halfway through a patrol at that site, just weeks after getting promoted to lieutenant. He drove straight back to the office, left his gear and letter of resignation, and refused to return any calls. I had a friend who was good friends with that guard, and when I asked if he knew what happened, he just said the guard refused to talk about it. Another time, we were picking up a psych patient from an ER, and when passing the hospital morgue, either late at night or early in the morning, we heard loud sobbing coming from inside. We flagged down a nurse and told them, who then called hospital security to check it out. They found nothing. The hallway where the morgue was located had a few other rooms, all of which were locked and closed, but the sound had seemed to come directly from the morgue. Another site I patrolled at night was an outdoor theater at the edge of town. A body had been found on an undeveloped part of the grounds and was thought to be a victim of Ted Bundy, as the time and area of death matched up with when Bundy was active in the area. Although it was never proven, this place was creepy as hell, and I didn't even know about the murder until after I had been working there for a while. I'm very used to being outside at night in rural areas with no electric lights, but this place had an oppressive darkness that seemed to absorb all light. Even on nights with a full moon, I had to use a flashlight to see anything. And even then, the flashlight seemed to have less reach and illumination there. Apart from the weird darkness, there was only one unexplained incident. It was my first night patrolling there. I stopped halfway through my patrol to have a smoke break and turned off my flashlight because the battery was running low. After finishing my cigarette, I went back to my patrol, turned my flashlight on, and froze. Alarm bells started to go off in my head, but I wasn't sure why. I hadn't heard or seen anything, but I just had this strong feeling that something was off. Then I realized what it was. My shadow was being cast in front of me, as though a light was shining on me from behind. I yelped, jumped around, and raised my hands, thinking someone was behind me. There was nothing. I didn't see anything that could have cast my shadow that way. I didn't stick around to see if my shadow would keep doing that. I turned my light off and returned to my car, using my dimmer phone light to see because I didn't want to see my shadow in front of me again. I never had that happen again, that property. I later tried to recreate it in the same position with no luck. Other than just being creepy and weirdly dark, there were no more incidents at that site that I couldn't find a rational explanation for. Although a mountain lion's screams and a guy proposing to his fiancée both nearly gave me heart attack. Story 9. There is a form of haunting classified as imprints, or something like that. It's not an actual spirit but an energy print left behind by someone or something that used to live there or frequented the area. The best example I heard was about a hotel room where people kept complaining about loud sexual sounds and thumping coming from the room next to theirs. It was empty. This happened repeatedly. Apparently someone had a lot of fun in that room. Again, these are all just theories and hearsay. Could be someone in another room making the noise and the sound traveling. Why would it happen repeatedly? Story 10. I was a Met police officer serving with the Diplomatic Protection Group during the 80s. One night, I was on duty protecting a government building in Carlton House Terrace, central London. In the early hours of the morning, I decided to take a walk around the outside perimeter to check that all was well. I opened the front door and saw a young boy standing about 12 feet away from me. He was wearing an Edwardian tweed cap, jacket, plus 4 trousers and long socks. He was also carrying an old-style, heavy leather football. The area around the property is often used for filming, as it's very atmospheric. Think Sherlock Holmes. I said, "Hello, what are you doing here?" He smiled and bounced the ball. I quickly realized that the ball made no sound when it struck the ground. Then, standing behind him, I noticed a woman in her late 30s. She was wearing a small straw hat with flowers and cherries on it. She wore a long cream cotton dress, Edwardian style, leg of mutton sleeves. She beckoned to the boy with her hand to come to her. He smiled at me, waved, and joined the woman. They turned away from me and vanished. I know I wasn't dreaming. I requested a signal check on my radio to my control. Perhaps I had experienced a time slip,